Joel, it is fantastic to have you on this episode of Leadership Bites. Welcome.
Thank you very much, and it's very nice to be here, Guy.
Well, I've really been looking forward to having you on. So I say this now with everybody. I came across you through the wondrousness of the internet, and we had a chat, and I'm absolutely fascinated by what you do and where you operate. So so glad that you're here. And with that in mind, it would be fantastic just to hear from you who you are and the role that you inhabit.
So, where am I? It's a bigger question, but in terms of, let's stick to the role initially at least. But so I'm sitting with the UNHCR, so the Refugee Agency. I'm sitting in Budapest, and I'm in charge of leadership development across the globe for UNHCR. We are actually part of a learning center. So I'm, as I said, sitting with the leadership development piece, but that also includes everything we do to support managers. I have a peer looking at talent and performance, and then another peer looking at what we call functional learning, which would be everything to do with, program finance, admin, all of that kind of stuff. And in total, we are actually close to 140 people delivering, designing, learning to UNHCR colleagues across the world, of which there are roughly 18,000 at the moment.
And just for anybody that doesn't know what UNHCR is, just bring that to some meaning for people.
Yeah. So we have a mandate, and we are very proud of that mandate, and that mandate is to protect refugees across the world. So we are the ones that provide food, shelter, support. Whenever there is a refugee, and a refugee is a person that have crossed an international border. So we run the camps, we provide support for refugees in cities across the world. But we also work closely with governments in terms of making sure the governments actually stick to the global principles that they've signed up to in terms of letting people cross borders and stuff like that. We are a proud and an old UN organization.
I'm always alert that when people say "and stuff like that," what that really means is, Guy, it's really very, very complex. And if I even start talking about it, it becomes quite a big conversation. So every role has their, and stuff like that. So I recognize that.
Indeed.
Yeah. So, and that's what really attracted me to you. I think the UNHCR as an organization and the role that you inhabit in it, because this is a podcast called Leadership Bites, so leadership's in the title. So within the role, what is that role's output? When you think, when I'm done at the end of a year and I look back on it and go, right, there might be the job and then there's the role. They're almost sometimes two different things. But in terms of a tick in the box for what this role has achieved and what it's about, what does that look like for you?
I mean, so maybe if I take a step back. Initially, when I started with UNHCR, so some 10 years ago, which was in a slightly different role, but that doesn't really matter. It was within the same area, management and leadership development. The role was very much about providing traditional workshop, 1 day, 2 day, 3 day, 4 day, 5 day training to our senior managers. So, how do I describe this? Being a massive international bureaucracy, we are very hierarchical as well. So you have sort of middle managers, age-wise, between 35 and 50, and then you have senior managers age-wise 45, 55. So we had lots of traditional face-to-face training for middle managers and for senior managers, bringing people together for workshops. I think doing a lot of the usual things you do in terms of leadership training, introduction to strategy, being strategic thinking, polarities, team effectiveness, team development. How do you work with your team? How do you work with your senior team? That was sort of what we did a lot of. I think what has been super interesting in the past 3 or 4 years has actually been the journey from much more of a training-based role to a role where we emphasize more and more the support on the job. So how do we actually support managers, not by providing traditional management or leadership content, but how do we provide a space where senior managers and leaders can actually have conversations either in smaller groups or with coaches that can help them grow their leadership repertoire. So when you ask me what does it look like, at the end of the year, I would say what makes this really interesting is that journey, and the fact that journey is not yet finished, but the fact that we spend more and more of our resources actually creating those spaces where senior leaders can have conversations about what it means to be a senior leader, and that we spend less and less of our resources on providing traditional standalone leadership training.
That's really interesting. So there's, in all elements of training, in my mind, there's the how to do a thing. So there's the process. So for example, if you just don't know how to give feedback classically, then we may need to show you, or here's a framework just to help guide you. Then there's the competence of that process. So, okay, you know it, but now do you have some skill around it? So, which often for leaders is something they may know how to give feedback, but do they have a skill around it? And then I'm hearing this, which I very much believe in, if I just want to calibrate my thinking to yours, that there's this level that says, okay, so we have people that know what feedback is, and if they don't, we'll show them, and they know how to use it because we'll coach them or enable them to do it. But then there's this space of conversation that might be, well, actually, I do know how to do it. I can do it well, but there might be times when I hesitate to, or there might be situations where it didn't work as I wanted it to, or whatever that might be. And when somebody senior hesitates or it doesn't quite work, it might be working 95% of the time, but let's have the conversation about the 5% of the time. And they can do that in a kind of a peer support or with coaches. So actually, it's the conversation that is the enabler, because I want to hear from the room. I want the nuances of reflection from others, and that's beyond the model. It's beyond it might be useful if you try it like this, but this is the growth of conversation, if I've heard you correctly.
Yeah, I think you have heard me correctly. I think another element is also the self-awareness that comes with the conversation, the realization that maybe I thought I was good at this, but maybe I'm not as good as I hear some of in terms of the feedback I get from the peers in the conversation, or in terms of the examples I hear from my peers in terms of how they provide feedback or what they do in terms of supporting staff development, for example, and learning on the job. And maybe there is stuff there I can pick up and actually apply when I go back to my everyday practice as a senior leader. I think it has also to do with the fact that, as we work with relatively senior managers, there is little, it's not because people can't learn to provide feedback better. So there is also a space for actually, going through the motions of training questions, of, providing feedback on listening skills and these things. But I think the real growth potential actually lies in the conversation with peers, and in the realizations of, what am I good at, what am I not so good at, and where do I myself see a potential for growth, that simply doesn't take place when you have your standard trainings. And we tended very much to be in love with, the standard trainings. So this is a massive shift for us as an organization.
There's real maturity in a kind of reflective practice that's happening in real time. There's something for some people, quite a scary thing, because I'm going to have to demonstrate or offer, maybe demonstrate might be the wrong word, I'm going to have to offer an element of vulnerability, perhaps, into that space. And sometimes I find that the first thing people have to become comfortable with is that my vulnerability doesn't make me vulnerable. And actually, if I see you doing it, it almost takes somebody's got to go first. So and if they do, then actually the nuance is a word here which I think is quite valuable. The nuance of it, the level that senior people are operating at, that turn of phrase is very useful, or that word would really help me. It's not sometimes they fundamentally don't know what to do. Okay, that's something else. But very often it is the subtlety of the finesse, the elegance, or this word I use a lot, which is the craft.
Yes.
So I think I'm hearing there that this is the nuancing, this is the hearing from your peers, this is maybe that collective recognition that, I'm not doing this as much as I should do, or we're not really doing this as much as we should do. Or so there's almost like a consensus sometimes that can come out of that. Is that resonating when I'm saying that?
Completely. I think, yes, I think you're completely right. I think vulnerability is a key part of this. And I think in my context of UNHCR, I think the vulnerability is important, because there has been an expectation that because you were a senior manager, you knew everything. And I think today you actually need senior managers that are able to step back and say, I'm sorry, I don't know, I'm not the expert here. I'm here to manage, I'm here to lead, but I'm not the content expert. That's why, I have you and you and you and you and you working with me. So I have to trust that you know what you're talking about. I can ask questions to explore, but you are the content expert, and showing that vulnerability and being able to talk about it, I think is critical. I think another really powerful insight in terms of these conversations that we try to move across the organization is also the realization that you're not alone. A lot of our senior managers are sitting as the equivalent of ambassadors, or the deputy or the assistant ambassador. So you're not embedded in a big day-to-day network of peers. So simply bringing people together for these conversations also help them to realize, and as you say, finesse language, realize where they may have a growth potential, but also, just affirming that what they do is actually okay. It's good enough. This is what most others are actually doing.
I'm also go on, Joe.
No, I just wanted, just to also throw in I think it has been very interesting also with the pandemic, and how the pandemic have also changed dynamics. So we have actually sort of accelerated this process, because there was a lot of resistance in March of last year to actually do senior management learning virtually. But we pushed very hard for these small group conversations facilitated by expert coaches or expert facilitators. And I think it has really, really taken off now. It has been helped a lot by COVID and the pandemic. And I have listened into many, many incredible intimate conversations and been part of very many intimate conversations, because the space is just intimate, even though we are on a screen. And I think in many ways it's actually better conversations that I participate in and that I hear today than it was when we did something similar but face to face.
I'm fascinated by this because I've just put a video out on my website and LinkedIn about this, my studio setup, for example. And one of the things I talk about in it it's a very brief video, but I almost go, I wondered how it would work. So it's not just, hey, look at my lovely studio, which it is. It's also actually me recognizing, I was thinking, gosh, is my craft going to translate into this digital medium? Because I always believe that, for that one-to-one work in particular, I really need to see the whites of the eyes and I need to be face to face and all those lovely phrases. And I'm finding the same thing. There's something about it that, as long as that person's sitting in the screen and we can see each other, and if all the mechanics are in place. And I have a couple of thoughts on why that might be, but I just wondered what why you think the mechanic of it is enabling to be as good as, if not sometimes greater than, being face to face.
I think there are fewer disruptions. So there is, in a way, there is more concentration in terms of, me interacting with you in this instance. What we have done that I think have helped as well is to have an external coach. So a trained coach to actually coach the conversation. So you also have a higher quality conversation. It's not just the usual conversation that takes place within the culture of the organization, in this case UNHCR, but it's actually a sort of a methodology being almost superimposed on the conversation that also delivers a different quality. But I think it's also simply, it's because we are very close. You are sitting literally 30 centimeters away from me, which is amazing. I think my mental picture, in a way, is very much of American movies and driving at night and listening to radio. That's the kind of sense I have when I'm in these conversations. So it's being in that closed space, listening intently to your questions and trying to respond to those questions. So that's the best way I can describe it. So it's that, midnight drives where you drive at night, there are stars and you listen to, some dude on the radio.
Yeah, you put that really better than I was going to, so thank you for that. And I think there is that, because I've always said, there's everything has mechanics, everything has a process, and if you've got good sound and you've got the lighting on and you're sat centrally in the screen, so it's very much your head rather than just, you're in sometimes I've gone on to meetings and somebody's using a video camera in a meeting room and they're at the end of a long table. And I'm like, my friend, I can't even see your face moving. So I said, you've got to come closer. So there's the mechanics of it. But I think what I'm hearing from you is, and you're quite right, that camera is, 12 inches or whatever it is from my face. And the picture of you. Now, if you've got 10 people on a screen, it's a slightly different mechanic. But actually, in a room, they'd be a lot further away. And if I'm wearing headphones or my sound is good as well, and, as you say, it becomes much more resonant. So there's something about it that might be exhausting for daily meetings all day. So when people talk about Zoom fatigue, video fatigue, it's because actually this level of intimacy actually is exhausting. But actually for the work that we might want to do, it's actually, do you know what, this is really rather useful. It actually helps. So I think what is Zoom fatigue for one is actually the reason it works maybe for us. I think I've just resonated with that more than I thought I had.
Yeah, I agree. I agree.
So so thank you. That actually that helps me. So thank you for that. And Joel, as you look at the I suppose the focus of learning that you bring to the role, in the context of what you can talk about, where is what are the main learning outcomes that you're looking for, the things that say, do you know what, to succeed, for leaders to succeed in this role, I have to enable either knowledge of, or reflection to, or a craft around? What are those ones that go, that's my role, to ensure that if you come in or you're here, that's where I'm aiming, where my effort goes to your craft?
I mean, so, well, I think the biggest shift that we're doing in terms of learning is really to help build the competencies, and I mean the competencies, skills, and also to some extent the experiences around a much more people-centric culture. So, I mean, your role as a manager, as a leader, in terms of creating a safe environment where it's okay to speak up. I mean, it's actually encouraged. You have. It's not about fighting. It's not about conflict, but it's about having conflicting points of view and have fruitful conversations around. Have we identified the right problem? And once we've agreed, yes, this is the problem, or maybe there is a problem below the problem that's the actual problem, then what are the kinds of solutions that we need to be looking at, and let's explore those different solutions together. So that whole people-centric culture, which is also about well-being, taking care, I mean, in particular with COVID, of course, taking more care of staff, being more aware of the stresses of staff. I mean, I just am off a call with a colleague whose child is now at home because the child was a close contact to another child with a COVID case. So what do I tell her? I tell her, of course, you need to balance out. You have your kid at home now. I mean, I won't ask you to do 120%. But I will have to ask you to do less, and you have to tell me if I'm asking too much for the next 10 days when your child is home. So making sure that there is that environment, also where it's okay to tell me, my kid is at home sick or not, for different reasons. Yeah. So we need to work out, different arrangements. I mean, fundamentally, it's people-centric. It's about people management. It's about linking development to performance conversations. It's about managers that support staff in terms of developing for performance, and it's about managers having a really good eye for what's the learning we can have as we work. So how can I help you with stretch assignments? How can we actually have a conversation around what have you learned managing this project, for example? So one of the examples I use with my colleagues is that I was managing actually with a British provider or a UK provider. Hang on a minute. Sorry.
Right.
I just had my wife and somebody else, walking through the room talking very loud.
It's all right. Normally, I get a postman at the door, so that's
okay. Okay.
Come at any moment, so don't worry.
Oh, so where did we leave off?
Well, I was to talk about. In essence, I translated it because it helps me kind of play it back to you to make sure I've understood it, which is that psychological safety within conversations that also drive performance.
Yes, yeah.
And that's an interesting one, isn't it? Because these are easy things to say. It's an interview. What kind of a manager are you? What kind of a leader are you? Well, I provide psychological safety, and but also I drive performance. And you go, wow, and we've all got that capability with a few buzzwords to say. But I think manifesting what I'm hearing from you is fine, but turning that into a tangible skill, something that we're all using maybe a lot more than we used to. That's almost where you got to.
Yeah. So, and it brings us back to the value of the conversations and why conversations are so important, and the art of conversations and the art of asking the right questions, because that, in a way, is what the manager and also the leader. And I mean, so I use the two interchangeably almost, but you need to be good at the conversations in terms of driving performance and linking performance to development, and also understanding what are the career aspirations of staff, and having, I mean, the hard conversations, but also having the good conversations. So how can I help to give you this kind of experience if you want to go from A to B? So how can I get you onto projects? How can I get you onto stretch assignments? How can I maybe lend you out to a different department for a bit, so you can get that kind of exposure and experience that will help you? Because as a manager, my role is really also to provide a good experience. It doesn't mean that I have to be, really, really nice always, but I have to think about what I do with the employee experience in mind. So how can I facilitate that you get as good an experience with UNHCR, from your point of entry to, when you depart the organization? And that's a huge shift for us, because, I mean, frankly, we haven't really considered management as important. We've been very task and are very task focused, which I think is really, really good. But we also need to take the management side of the equation equally to heart. And I mean, personally, I've learned. It's been kind of an sort of not epiphany, but an aha moment. Trying to think about what I do as a manager from the perspective of what kind of experience does this actually deliver for the individual? Because that's a complete reconfiguration of
Joe, I was just thinking of the way I often put it is, those kinetic balls on the toys that sit on a desk, and you pick one up and you click the side.
Yes.
And then it goes through 8 balls and clicks out the other. I go, so when you for every action, an equal and opposite reaction, right? When you say a thing in a certain way at a certain time, and you let that ball, as a metaphor, drop, boom, it may impact on the person that you're talking to, but then it may impact on the person that they go and talk to, and then but then exactly. 6 balls down the line, that may come at you with your habitualized behavior has now meant that they're a little bit more submissive. So that ball that pops out the other end could be, those other balls in between. That could be, if each one was a month or a day, it could be 6 hours later, 6 days later, 6 months later, 6 years
That's
later.
very nice. Yeah, very nice.
Boom, it pops out the other end, and it's the historic tapping that you've been doing. And I think when I kind of thought about it like that, I thought that helped me go, am I prepared to take on board both the short game but also the long game? And the understanding that, well, I just need it done now, and I just, but actually, what might that mean to this organization if collectively we're all doing that over a 2-year period or a 3-year period? And this is why I like your conversations focused, because I get to hear what's going on outside of my own truth. And do I connect to my responsibility as a contributor to the environment and the culture of this organization rather than just my own output. And that's very interesting for me. And I think when leaders really buy into that contribution outside of their own need, that's when I think you get shift. And I think I'm hearing you have your own recognition, and that's indicative of that.
And I mean, I really like that picture with the small balls. I think that it's so right, and it speaks to the systemic nature of organizations. I think. I mean, and that's also your point in a way, isn't it, Guy? That you cannot just look at your own little piece of the puzzle. I mean, you have to be mindful that there is a bigger piece, and what you do in your piece may impact on what goes on in other parts of the organization. And just to go back to the conversational point, I think it's also when you, at least for me, so maybe I'm just making assumptions here, but I think for many people, it's a lot easier also to reflect on where their own practice doesn't work or works well when they listen in on experiences from other peers. So it's when you're sort of slightly removed, you have a bird's eye perspective on the conversation, you actually realize that, this is where Joel keeps, doing the wrong thing, but he can't see it, but I can see that that's what's happening. Yeah.
But also, I think you see yourself reflected back at in the action.
Yes. Yeah,
oh gosh, I do that.
Yes. Now, exactly. Now I realize what
that sounds awesome, and I don't do anything like that.
Yeah.
I think some of the greatest revelations are when people see excellence in others and then realize, I don't do that, or that is fascinating.
But there is also something about the nature of the conversation that actually helps to bring it out in a way that I could not bring out by teaching. I can't stand. I mean, sometimes if you are really, really good, of course, at facilitating or teaching, you can bring it out, but it's difficult.
Well, I think you're one person, and even in your crafted excellence, if I thought I was one of the best facilitators around, I'm only one person. I can only talk for so long in a room. And I've made that mistake whereby trying to bring learning and insight to all, I've spent a lot of time talking. Whereas actually, if there's 10 other or 5 other people who have bought into and are not playing the game, but they're contributing appropriately, then you're facilitating them facilitating.
Yes.
And there's then there's not just you trying to make it happen. There's 5 challenges, there's 5 curiosities, there's 5 offerings of story. And you could be the best facilitator in the room, but if you just keep talking, there's no room for everybody else. And I learned that because I love the sound of my own voice, Joel. That may be appropriate, but the craft is shut up and let others speak. And
good.
So, Joel, how did you how does one get to your that role that you inhabit? I can see some roles being quite obvious, the commercially driven environments, and you're in that space, but the UN and a role within that. What was your journey?
Yeah, thank you for asking. It's kind of, obviously it's always interesting when it's your own journey, but there is at least the Danish. So I'm Danish, and the Danish government have a scheme where they actually fund fresh graduates entry into the UN for 1 or 2 or 3 years. So I was fortunate enough to get into one of those jobs when I finished university back in the 90s. So I had 3 years with UNDP, which is a United Nations Development Program. And actually I was back, I was in Kenya, where I am back now. So that's sort of kind of a full circle. So I started with UNDP, then we in Kenya. Then we went back, my wife and I, to Copenhagen and spent a little bit of time there. Then she got a job. I followed. I went into consulting. So spent almost 10 years in management consulting, and at some point realized that I hadn't had a conversation about the quality of what we do as consultants. So I thought maybe it's time that I go back to the UN, and I saw a job opening with UNHCR, and the only reason I applied was really because it was opening this new learning center in Budapest, and I thought, okay, that's kind of an interesting opportunity because it's a new entity within. It's a new location, so it's not going to be sort of hardcore UN. It's not stepping into an old dusty office. It's actually being part of shaping something new. So that took us to Budapest, and then I've been sort of out of UNHCR and done some. There is a small staff college, UN staff college in Torino. I've spent a couple of years there, and then I came back. So I've been, yeah. I started with the UN. I'm now back with the UN, but done lots of management consulting in between. And I think it's a.
And what pulls you back to the UN? What I mean, I know there's that opportunity, but the UN itself, is there something about that?
Yes. There is also something about the UN. I think there is something about in a way, the convening power of the UN and the ability to attract. Very, very interesting individuals. So, I mean, like now I have this conversation with you. I mean, there are lots of these kinds of moments that I really, really appreciate a lot. Another example, I mean, I met another gentleman, also from the UK, by the way, who reached out maybe a year ago and asked me whether I would want to be part of conversations that he is convening. And then we now meet virtually, once every 2 months, 3 months. There are, a gentleman from FIFA, but everybody, very different fields, but involved in learning and just having conversations. I mean, and this is what I really, really appreciate about the UN. There is something about the diversity of the UN as well. The fact that you have colleagues from literally every country of the world. When I walk down the corridor, I mean, not that I have done that for a while, but when I used to walk down the corridors, I mean, you would hear, Hungarian, English, Spanish, Italian, French. I mean, it's just very, very rich, which is, it's just fascinating. And but I would just, so that we have these conversations also about words and concepts, and because they mean something different to different people in different cultures, so you have to constantly be alert and adjust. And I mean, are we actually, if we talk about accountability, what part of it is it actually we're talking about, and does that mean the same to me as a Dane, as opposed to the Hungarian colleague or the Italian colleague or the colleague from Mali? So but it's part of, it's deeply frustrating at times, but it's also incredibly fascinating.
I have to say that would be, if I think about being in a relatively static group of people, I'm in one country most of the time, there's a relatively uniform demographic, etc. And even then, of course, when you say accountability, what do you mean? But of course, when you then go into your complexity, I imagine you have to find it a beautiful thing, because otherwise you'd literally go bonkers. You have to go, this is awesome, because those cultural dynamics and etc. would be a part that I understand to a greater or lesser degree, because obviously doing this for 20 odd years, I've come across different cultures, but that to be such an inherent part of the role, I imagine, would be absolutely fascinating. And when you go home and say to the people in your life, we're going to Budapest, how do you, what's the reaction when you say that?
No, I think what's interesting, honestly, I mean, but it's a very good question. I think what is incredibly frustrating when we go home, and probably also part of the reason why we keep getting back out, is that people don't understand. Family, friends, very few understand and are really interested, because it's too far away from their reality. So when we have been back, and when we've agreed, now we go back to settle in Copenhagen again, then 6 months later we look at each other and say, no, we need to get out, because it's as though, you have the longer you're away, the sort of the bigger the black hole is, where you have experiences, you have friends that your old friends can't connect with or don't understand, or so it's like living a life where there is a big chunk of it that's simply not part of the conversations that you have when you're back home.
So this is what I'm hearing from you there, is there's a sense of, it comes with its own weight, it comes with its own kind of things that need to be worked through. But if I walk away from it, might be the wrong word, but if I move away from it, I feel that pull.
Yeah,
it's call it the curiosity of people's stories, or the adrenaline of the situation, or just the sheer kind of scope and scale of some of the things. There's something there that's got its in the nicest possible way, it's got its hook in you.
Yes, completely
Pulling you.
I mean, the way so when I discuss it with my wife, I think the way we try to verbalize it a little bit is that so whenever you are in a new country, in a new context, like now we are back in Kenya, even though we've been here 23 years ago, it's completely changed. It's like being in a new country, and it requires sort of an additional level of alertness, of attention to, trying to understand what are people saying, trying to understand, why are they doing what they're doing, just trying to navigate, how do I get a phone, how do I get, a new tax number, how do I get water, how do we pay it on? It's that additional level of alertness that at least for us, is addictive. So you become sort of hypersensitive, whereas sometimes, when you've been living in the same city for 10 years, 20 years, or maybe your whole life, then you have a depth of, you're anchored in a completely different and very solid way. But maybe you also just go through most of your days and don't really see, the streets around you or the roads, so don't think about the bank or, whatever you need to think about. But you take it for granted in a way that you can't do when you're out, because there is so much you don't understand.
So there's a kind of enhanced quality of living for you. There's almost a sensitivity that it brings when you put yourself into that space.
Yes, yeah, that's very nicely put, Guy.
Well, listen, we were alert to time when we started, so I'm just going to say this has been fascinating, just to hear you talk, and just to, like with all roles, of course, we've only touched the surface, but it's a lovely insight just into you and your thinking and the space that you work in. And I could get into the whole dynamics of delivering globally, and there might be a secondary conversation that I pick up with you on, but just thank you for your input, thank you for your time, and it's been very, very much appreciated.
Thank you, Guy, and thank you very much for the questions and for the conversation.
Absolutely.
It's been great.
I'll press the stop button.
Thanks.